What would you do if you were in the same circumstances with the characters in the following stories? We would very love to know, and you could share it below under the comment sections. Now, let the stories unfold.
The white pill rested neatly in the center of a palm, small and harmless as a grain of sugar. Every morning, Kennedy Shaw placed that pill into the hand of the man sitting in the wheelchair. Every morning, he swallowed it without asking a single question. Ashton Mercer, the name that had once made all of New York speak in whispers, the name people only dared utter behind closed doors, now couldn't even rise on his own to pour himself a glass of water. 6 months in bed. 6 months staring at his legs as if they were two dead pieces of wood. 6 months believing that fate had brought the life of a kingpin to its end in the cruelest way imaginable. Not with a bullet, not with a blade, but with helplessness. No one asked why he wasn't recovering. No one suspected a thing. The white pills kept arriving day after day, and he kept taking them, believing they were the only hope he had left. Until Kennedy walked into that penthouse on the 60th floor. A 27-year-old woman with no money, no home, and no one standing behind her. She came here not because she was brave, but because there was nowhere else left for her to go. She had nothing to lose, and perhaps that was exactly why she was the only one willing to see what no one wanted her to know. This is the story of how one tiny pill could imprison the most powerful kingpin in the city, and how a girl with nothing became the only person who could set him free. If you want to know what that pill really was, and who had been behind it all along, stay with us. Don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next turns in this story. But before Kennedy Shaw became the one who held that secret, she was only a young woman trying to survive one day at a time. That morning began like every other morning at the Harrison Hotel, one of the 3-star hotels in the heart of Manhattan. Kennedy stood behind the front desk, her back straight, a professional smile fixed on her lips, her hands moving quickly through the check-in process for each arriving guest. Her high heels had been squeezing her feet for 8 straight hours, but she wasn't allowed to flinch, wasn't allowed to sit down, wasn't allowed to show even the slightest sign of exhaustion. That was the unspoken rule of this profession. The smile had to remain flawless no matter if her feet were bleeding inside her shoes. Kennedy had done this job for 2 years. 2 years without taking a vacation because she was afraid of losing her job. 2 years without being late by even a single minute because she was afraid her pay would be docked. 2 years of bowing her head before demanding guests, swallowing every insult, holding on to her smile even when she was falling apart inside. She had thought that effort like that would be rewarded, that if she were patient enough and worked hard enough, things would get better. But life didn't work that way. Everything changed at around 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when a VIP guest strode up to the front desk with a face flushed red with anger. He was a middle-aged businessman, the kind of man accustomed to being served and unwilling to accept any delay. He wanted to switch to a room on a higher floor, but the hotel was fully booked. Kennedy explained as politely as she could, offering alternative solutions, but he didn't want to listen. He wanted someone to blame, and Kennedy was the easiest choice. He called for the manager and said Kennedy had shown him disrespect, said she had laughed at him, said she didn't deserve to work in a place like this. Every word of it was a lie. Kennedy knew that. The manager probably knew it too. But he was a VIP guest, the one paying, the one with power. And she was only a front desk employee who could be replaced at any moment. The manager called Kennedy into the office as soon as the guest walked away. It was a small room, lit by the cold glare of fluorescent lights, with a wooden desk and 2 chairs facing one another. Kennedy sat down and tried to keep her voice from trembling. She was about to explain, about to recount exactly what had happened, but the manager lifted a hand to stop her. The decision had already been made, he said, his voice flat and even, as though he were reading a weather report. The hotel couldn't keep an employee who made customers unhappy. She would be paid through the end of the month, and she didn't need to come back the following Monday. Kennedy wanted to scream that it was unfair, that she had done nothing wrong, that her 2 years of devotion couldn't be erased by a single false accusation. But she didn't scream. She didn't cry. She only nodded, rose to her feet, and walked out of the office with legs that felt as heavy as lead. Outside, the city was still as noisy as ever. Cars were still moving. People were still hurrying past. Life was still going on as if nothing had happened. Only Kennedy's world had just collapsed. She took the subway back to the Bronx and stood the entire 45-minute ride, because there were no seats left, staring at the unfamiliar faces around her, and wondering whether any of them were carrying an abyss inside them too. Kennedy's studio apartment was on the 5th floor of an aging building, where the elevator was broken more often than it worked, and the sound of rats, skittering through the walls, had become a familiar part of every night. She opened the door, stepped inside, and immediately saw the white sheet of paper taped to it, a notice from the landlord. Pay the rent within 14 days, or move out. Kennedy pulled the paper down, stepped farther inside, and closed the door behind her. The 15-square-meter room greeted her with its familiar smell of dampness, with the cracked wall she had covered with an old poster, with the steady drip from the kitchen faucet the landlord had promised to fix 6 months earlier. She sat down on the bed and took out her phone to check her bank account. $36. Enough for a few meals if she bought nothing but instant noodles and bread. Not enough for rent. Not enough for electricity and water. Not enough for anything. Kennedy looked around the tiny room where she had lived for the past 3 years. This was all she had. A narrow bed with a faded sheet. A mini refrigerator that hummed all night long. A small table barely large enough for a laptop and a glass of water. And in 14 more days, she would lose even these things. She thought of her parents, who had died in a car accident when she was 19, leaving her alone in a strange city with a pile of debt and unfinished dreams. She thought of the college degree she had never completed because she couldn't afford the tuition. She thought of all the times she had told herself that if she just tried a little harder, things would get better. But things hadn't gotten better. They had only grown worse. Kennedy didn't cry. Not because she was strong, but because she was too exhausted. Tears required energy, and she had run out of that long ago. She only sat there in the darkness, slowly settling over the small room, wondering whether life still had anything left for someone like her. The next day, Kennedy didn't know where to go. She woke on her worn old bed, stared up at the damp, stained ceiling, and realized that for the first time in 2 years, there was nowhere she needed to be, no shift to report to. No coworkers waiting for her, no customers who needed serving. Only an emptiness stretching from dawn to dusk. She put on an old coat, slipped into a pair of worn-out sneakers, and stepped out of the apartment without any real destination in mind. Her feet carried her onto the subway, past familiar stations, and at last brought her to Central Park. It was an October morning. The air had begun to turn cool, and yellow leaves drifted down here and there across the paths. Kennedy found an empty bench near the lake and sat down, watching the stream of people moving past her. Everyone was headed somewhere. Joggers ran by with their headphones pressed tight to their ears, sweat glimmering in the sunlight. Mothers pushed strollers while chatting with friends as they walked. Businessmen in neatly tailored suits, coffee cups in hand, hurried toward meetings that mattered. Everyone had a purpose. Everyone had somewhere to be. Only Kennedy sat there, motionless, like an object forgotten in the current of life. She didn't know how long she had been sitting there. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. Time became meaningless when there was nothing left to wait for. She only watched the small ripples moving across the lake, watched the ducks gliding through the water, and tried not to think about the eviction notice folded neatly inside her coat pocket. Then a woman sat down beside her. Kennedy didn't pay much attention at first. In the park, people sitting next to one another on a bench was nothing unusual. But when she glanced sideways, she realized at once that this woman was utterly unlike the world around them. She looked to be somewhere past 50, with platinum blonde hair cut short and styled so perfectly that every strand seemed as though it had just come from an expensive salon. The outfit she wore probably cost more than Kennedy's rent for an entire year. The fabric soft and luxurious, the tailoring exquisite, not a single crease in sight. Around her neck hung a strand of flawless white pearls, the kind Kennedy had only ever seen in fashion magazines. The woman said nothing. She simply sat there, looking out over the lake as if she were enjoying an ordinary morning. But Kennedy could feel her gaze drifting over from time to time, observing, measuring, as though she were reading an open book. Several minutes passed in silence, then the woman spoke, her voice gentle but clear. "You look like you're carrying the whole world on your shoulders." Kennedy startled and turned to look at her. The woman was looking straight at her, pale green eyes filled with what seemed like genuine concern, or at least something that looked very much like it. Kennedy didn't know how to answer. She wasn't used to opening herself to strangers, especially strangers who looked as though they belonged to a world completely different from hers. But there was something in the woman's voice, in the way she looked at her, that made Kennedy feel heard for the first time in a very long while. She let out a breath and spoke without even knowing why she was speaking at all. Just a bad day. Several bad days in a row. The woman nodded with understanding. I know that feeling. When everything seems to fall apart all at once and you don't know where to begin again. Kennedy looked at her in surprise. It was hard to imagine that someone dressed like this had ever known anything terrible in her life. The woman seemed to read the thought from her face and gave a faint smile. Money doesn't solve every problem, my girl. Sometimes it only creates more of them. She held out her hand. I'm Monica Hale. Kennedy shook it automatically, feeling the softness of her skin and the faint trace of expensive perfume. Kennedy Shaw. Monica nodded as though she had already committed the name to memory. Then she studied Kennedy for a long moment, her eyes seeming to weigh some private thought. Kennedy, I'm going to be direct because I'm not a woman who likes to circle around things. I'm looking for someone for a very particular kind of work. Not ordinary house cleaning or cooking. My son was in an accident 6 months ago. He's paralyzed now, and he needs someone to care for him 24 hours a day. Kennedy blinked, not understanding why Monica was telling her any of this. Monica went on, her voice still calm and even. I need someone patient, someone trustworthy, and most of all, someone without too many ties outside. The job requires living in our home and caring for him full-time. The pay is generous, room and board are included, and you'll have everything you need. Kennedy felt her throat go dry. Why are you telling me this? You don't know anything about me. Monica smiled, the smile of a woman accustomed to judging people. I've been watching you for the past hour. You've been sitting here alone, no phone, no friends, no sign that you're waiting for anyone. Your shoes are old, but they're still clean. Your coat is worn, but it's been kept carefully. That tells me you're a woman with self-respect, a woman who works hard, and a woman in trouble. Kennedy didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Insulted? Because her circumstances were so painfully obvious? Or grateful? Because someone had seen straight through her? Monica took a business card from her wallet and placed it in Kennedy's hand. I'm not forcing you. Think about my offer. If you're interested, call this number. She rose to her feet and brushed lightly at her suit, though there wasn't a speck of dust on it. Before she walked away, she turned back and gave Kennedy one last look. I look at you and see someone who needs a chance. You look at me and see someone who needs help. Maybe this is the moment when both of us find what we need. Then Monica Hale walked away, her posture perfectly straight, her heels striking the concrete path with a steady rhythm until she disappeared beyond the row of brilliant yellow trees. Kennedy remained there alone, staring down at the card in her hand. The paper was thick, the letters embossed. Monica Hale's name set in the center with a phone number beneath it. No address, no title, only a name and a vague promise. Kennedy's mind spun with questions. Why would a woman like Monica approach someone like her? Why here, in Central Park, at exactly this moment? Could this be a trap? Some refined sort of scam aimed at desperate people? But then another voice rose inside her head, cold and practical. What do you have left to lose? $36 in the bank. 14 days before you're thrown out onto the street. No family, no friends, no one who cares whether you live or die. If this is a trap, at least it's a trap with a roof and food. Kennedy slipped the card into her coat pocket, stood up, and started walking toward the subway station. She still hadn't made up her mind, but for the first time in days, she had something to think about besides despair. That night, Kennedy lay on her bed but couldn't fall asleep. Monica Hale's business card rested on the table by the window, and the streetlight spilling in made the embossed letters shimmer faintly in the dark. She had looked at it 100 times, turning it over and over in her hands, as though doing that might somehow reveal the true meaning hidden behind the offer. Her mind kept circling the same questions. Was this a scam? What kind of scam targeted young women with nothing left to lose, promising good work only to turn them into victims of trafficking rings? Kennedy had read enough news to know that things like that happened every day in this city, but then she thought of Monica, of the expensive suit, the strand of pearls, the high heels that probably cost thousands of dollars. Would swindlers really need to invest that much in an act? She looked around her miserable room. The ceiling was stained with spreading patches of damp. In one corner, the peeling paint had exposed the red brick beneath. The little refrigerator hummed as though it might die at any moment. Then her gaze drifted to the eviction notice still folded on the table. 13 days left. 13 days before she became homeless. She picked up her phone and opened her banking app once again. even though she already knew the balance wouldn't change. $36. Not even enough to rent a cheap motel room for one night if she ended up out on the street. Kennedy let out a long breath and stared up at the ceiling. She had tried to live the right way. Study hard, work hard, never cause trouble for anyone, and still life had shoved her to the edge. Maybe it was time to accept that living the right way didn't always lead to a good ending. The next morning, when the first light slipped through the dirty window, Kennedy had made her decision. She picked up her phone and dialed the number on the card. Her heart beat faster with every ring. 1 ring, 2 rings, then a soft click, and Monica's voice came through, calm as though she had been expecting this call all along. "I knew you'd call." Kennedy didn't know how to respond to that kind of certainty. She only said, briefly, that she wanted to know more about the job. Monica didn't ask many questions. She simply gave Kennedy an address and told her to come within 2 hours. Mercer Tower, the 60th floor. Kennedy had never heard the name before, but when she searched it on Google, she understood why. It was one of the most expensive buildings in Manhattan, a place reserved for the super rich, people whose existence belonged to a universe entirely different from hers. She took a quick shower in cold water, because the water heater had broken the week before, then put on the neatest clothes she owned, a white blouse and black slacks she had kept from her old job interviews. She smoothed the wrinkles with her hands because she didn't own an iron, brushed her hair carefully, and looked at herself in the mirror. A 27-year-old woman with gray-blue eyes that had lost their light, skin gone pale from lack of sleep, and the appearance of someone who had endured far too much. She didn't know what she was walking into, but she knew she couldn't stay where she was any longer. 45 minutes later, Kennedy stood in front of Mercer Tower, her head tilted back as she stared up at the 60-story structure of glass and dark steel rising straight into the Manhattan sky. Sunlight flashed across the glass surface, making the building look like a giant blade driven into the heart of the city. Kennedy had never stepped into a place like this before. She hesitated outside the revolving door, feeling as though she didn't belong there, like a blot of ink spilled across a sheet of pure white paper. But before she could change her mind, Monica appeared. She stepped out from inside, still as immaculate as the day before, this time dressed in an elegant gray dress and glossy black heels. She smiled at Kennedy as though they were old friends who had known each other for years. "You're right on time. I appreciate that." Then Monica led her inside, and Kennedy stepped into an entirely different world. The building's lobby was enormous, its white marble floor polished so brilliantly that she could see her own reflection in it. The walls were paneled in dark wood, and abstract paintings hung there, pieces Kennedy guessed were probably worth millions. Security staff in black suits stood at every corner, nodding respectfully to Monica as she passed, with the kind of deference one might show a queen. No one looked at Kennedy, or if they did, they looked through her as though she didn't exist at all. Monica led her to a private elevator tucked away in the far corner of the lobby. There were no buttons, only a keycard panel. Monica touched her card to it, and the elevator doors opened with a smooth silence. Inside, the elevator was lined in red velvet and fitted with a large mirror. Kennedy saw her own reflection beside Monica's, and for the first time truly understood how vast the distance between them was. The elevator rose straight to the 60th floor. No stops. No one else entered. There was only silence, and the sound of Kennedy's own breathing in her ears. When the doors opened, Kennedy had to fight not to stand there, open-mouthed. The penthouse stretched out before her like a dream, or perhaps a hallucination. The ceilings soared overhead. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls looked out over all of Central Park below, the great green expanse lying in the middle of the forest of skyscrapers like a peaceful oasis. Inside, the furnishings were all glass, steel, and leather, modern to the point of coldness. Sculptures were placed throughout the space. Crystal chandeliers glittered overhead. A glossy black piano sat silent in the corner, looking as though no one had touched it in a very long time. But something was wrong. Kennedy felt it the moment she stepped inside. The penthouse was too perfect, too spotless, too still. There was no music, no laughter, no smell of food, not a single sign that people actually lived there. There was only a lifeless perfection, like a museum, or like a beautifully decorated prison. Monica led Kennedy through the living room, then down a long hallway lined with framed photographs Kennedy didn't have time to study closely. At the end of the hall stood a closed door made of dark wood. Monica stopped and turned to face her. "My son is in here. Ashton. He isn't easy to deal with. I should warn you. The accident changed him a great deal. But I believe you have enough patience to handle him. Kennedy swallowed, feeling her heart begin to pound faster. She wanted to ask Monica about the details of the job, about the salary, about what exactly she would be expected to do. But before she could open her mouth, Monica placed her hand on the doorknob. Are you ready? Kennedy didn't know. She didn't know what she was stepping into. Didn't know who the man behind that door was. Didn't know how her life was about to change after this moment. But she nodded, because she had no other choice. Monica opened the door, and Kennedy stepped inside. The room was larger than Kennedy's entire apartment in the Bronx. Light slipped through the heavy charcoal gray curtains, casting blurred ribbons of pale brightness across the dark wooden floor. The faint scent of disinfectant lingered in the air, mingling with something else Kennedy couldn't quite name. Perhaps the smell of confinement, of a space that had been sealed shut for too long. The furniture in the room was all expensive. An intricately carved oak cabinet, a black leather sofa sitting in silence in the corner, landscape paintings in gilded frames. But all of it looked as though it had never truly been used, like props in a play with no audience. And in the center of the room, on a large bed covered in immaculate white sheets, was the man Monica had called her son. Ashton Mercer sat propped against a stack of pillows, his body tilted slightly toward the window, as though he had been staring outside for hours before they entered. Kennedy didn't know what she had expected. Perhaps a frail, pale man with the unmistakable look of illness written all over him. But Ashton Mercer wasn't like that. He looked to be about 33, broad-shouldered, his muscles still firm despite having been bedridden for 6 months. His black hair was cut short and neatly kept, with a few early silver strands at his temples. His face was sharply cut, with a square jaw, a straight nose, and a faint scar running along the left side of his neck. But it was his eyes that struck her most. Dark brown eyes, the color of black coffee, cold and empty of feeling. When Kennedy stepped inside, those eyes turned toward her and moved over her from head to toe in one slow, measuring sweep, as though he were considering an object not worth buying. Kennedy felt stripped bare beneath that gaze. She realized she had been holding her breath and had to remind herself to inhale. Ashton's legs lay motionless beneath the blanket, flat and still, like 2 pieces of wood. That was the only visible proof that anything was wrong with him physically. Everything else about him radiated a kind of buried power. The power of a man who had spent his life giving orders and being obeyed. Monica stepped to the bedside, her voice gentle, as if she were speaking to a difficult child. Ashton, this is Kennedy Shaw. She'll be your new caregiver. Ashton didn't look at Monica. His eyes stayed fixed on Kennedy, unblinking, unmoving. Silence stretched for several seconds, heavy as lead. Then he spoke, his voice low and cold as winter wind slipping through a crack in the door. How long before you run away? Kennedy blinked, not entirely sure she had heard him right. She glanced at Monica for guidance, but the woman simply stood there with the faintest smile on her lips, as though this were a test Kennedy would have to pass on her own. She turned back to Ashton and tried to keep her voice calm. I don't understand what you mean. Ashton tilted his head slightly, his gaze still sharp as glass. The ones before you. The longest lasted 3 weeks. And the shortest, Monica? 2 days, Monica answered, her voice still light, almost casual. She cried and quit after the second breakfast. Ashton gave a slow nod, as though that were some private triumph worth savoring. And what about you, Kennedy Shaw? Do you think you're different from them? Do you think you can endure a crippled bastard like me? Kennedy felt the blood rush into her face. She didn't know whether this was a test or simply cruelty, but she had survived too much to be crushed by a few poisonous words. She drew in a deep breath, then looked straight into Ashton's eyes, without blinking, without retreating. I don't know whether I'm special or not, but I'm not in the habit of giving up. Something flickered through Ashton's eyes for the briefest moment. Surprise? Interest? Kennedy couldn't tell, but it vanished as quickly as it came, replaced by a mocking sound of amusement that never touched his eyes. They all say that. Then he turned his head toward the window. As though Kennedy no longer existed, the conversation was over. Or rather, Ashton had decided on his own that it was over. Monica touched Kennedy lightly on the elbow, signaling for her to follow her outside. Kennedy cast one last glance at Ashton before stepping out of the room. He was still staring toward the window, his solitary silhouette framed against the gray curtains. And Kennedy found herself wondering how many hours a day he sat like that, looking out at a world he no longer belonged to. Out in the hallway, Monica closed the door softly behind them and turned to Kennedy. "You did well." He usually makes people cry with the first sentence. Kennedy didn't know whether that was meant as praise or not. She only nodded and waited for whatever came next. Monica slipped a hand into her pocket and brought out a small amber bottle. Inside were tiny white pills, so small and harmless looking they might have been mints. "This is Ashton's medication." Monica said it quietly, and suddenly her voice had changed. The usual softness was gone, replaced by something far more serious. "1 pill a day, at the same time. Don't forget. Don't skip it." Kennedy took the bottle and felt its almost weightless presence in her palm. "What is it for?" Monica looked at her, and her pale green eyes sharpened like blades. "To stabilize his condition." "You're here to follow instructions, Kennedy, not to ask questions." Her voice remained gentle, but there was something beneath it that sent a chill down Kennedy's spine. It wasn't a reminder. It was a warning. Kennedy nodded and asked nothing more. Monica continued, her tone returning to normal as though that moment of tension had never happened. "If he refuses to take it, you're to make sure he takes it anyway. Crush it into his food if you have to. That is a mandatory rule. No exceptions." Kennedy wanted to ask why. Why did it have to be forced on him? Why hide it in his food? If this was medicine meant to help him, why would Ashton refuse to take it? But she looked into Monica's eyes and knew this wasn't the moment to ask. Some questions, once spoken aloud, would cost her the only chance she had left, and Kennedy didn't have any other chances. "I understand." She said it evenly, with no emotion in her voice. Monica smiled, but the smile didn't make Kennedy feel any safer. "Good. I'll have someone bring your things over. Your room is at the end of the hall, directly across from Ashton's. If he needs anything during the night, you'll hear him." Then Monica turned and walked away, the sound of her heels striking the wooden floor in an even rhythm, growing fainter and fainter until Kennedy was left standing alone in the stillness of the hall. She looked down at the bottle in her hand. The white pills lay quietly inside, tiny and harmless. But why had Monica emphasized them so strongly? Why had her eyes changed like that when she spoke of them? Kennedy shook her head, trying to brush aside thoughts she didn't need. She was here to work, not to investigate. She needed money, needed a place to stay, needed one chance to keep herself alive. And this was her chance. She slipped the bottle into her pocket and started toward her room. At least, that was what she thought then, that this was only an ordinary job, that those little white pills were only ordinary medicine, that everything would be fine. But deep down, a quiet voice kept whispering that something wasn't right. And Kennedy had learned long ago never to ignore that voice. 2 weeks passed more quickly than Kennedy had expected. Little by little, she grew used to the rhythm of life inside the penthouse on the 60th floor, to the glass walls looking out over the city, to the heavy silence draped across every corner. Each morning she woke at 6 o'clock, prepared breakfast in the sleek modern kitchen with its expensive appliances that had taken her several days to learn how to use. She carried the meal into Ashton's room, helped him with his personal care, changed his clothes, wheeled him into the living room if he wanted, though most of the time he only wanted to sit by the bedroom window. And every day, at exactly 8 o'clock in the morning, she handed him one white pill. Ashton was no longer as harsh as he had been on the first day. He no longer asked how long it would be before she gave up, no longer looked at her as though she were some object too insignificant to notice. But he hadn't grown any friendlier either. He had simply accepted her presence the way one accepts a new piece of furniture. Something there in the room, but not something one needed to engage with. Most of the time, Ashton was silent. He could sit for hours by the window, gazing down at Central Park below, his dark brown eyes distant, as though they were fixed on some faraway place no one else could see. Kennedy often found herself wondering what he thought about during those long stretches of silence. His life before the accident? Everything he had lost? Or everything he would never be able to reclaim? She didn't ask. It wasn't her place. Monica came by regularly, usually in the afternoon, each visit lasting about an hour. She brought fresh flowers, expensive fruit, and those sweet, polished smiles. But Kennedy began to notice something strange. Each time Monica arrived, her first question was never, "How is my son today?" or "Has he been eating well?" Her first question was always, "Did he take his medicine on time?" The first time, Kennedy didn't think much of it. The second time, she assumed Monica was simply worried about her son's health. But by the 5th, the 6th, the 7th time, when that same question returned again and again, like some fixed ritual, Kennedy began to feel that something wasn't right. Why would a mother be so obsessed with the medicine? Why didn't she ask about his progress, his mood, or anything else at all? But Kennedy said nothing. She only nodded, reported that everything had been done exactly as instructed, and carried on with her work. Then that night came. An evening like every other evening. Kennedy brought Ashton his dinner, waited for him to finish, then reached for the pill bottle. She tipped one small white pill into her palm, picked up a glass of water, and stepped over to the bed. Ashton looked at the pill in her hand, and for the first time in 2 weeks, he said something that wasn't an order or a clipped reply. "I hate that thing." Kennedy stopped, startled. She looked at Ashton and saw that he was staring at the pill with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't the usual coldness. It was disgust and exhaustion, the deep exhaustion of someone who had endured far too much for far too long. She didn't know how to respond, so she simply stood there and waited. Ashton went on, his voice low and slow, as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. "It tastes bitter, not like any medicine I've ever taken, and every time I swallow it, my body feels heavier, like someone is pressing me down, forcing me deeper into this bed." He lifted his eyes to hers, and for the first time his dark brown gaze held no sharpness, only weariness. "Just one night. Could I go one night without taking it?" Kennedy felt something tear inside her. Monica had made herself perfectly clear. Every day, at the same hour, without fail. If Kennedy didn't follow that order, she could lose her job, and losing her job meant losing everything. Losing her room, losing her income, going back to nothing, back to the street. But when she looked into Ashton's eyes, she didn't see the stubbornness of a difficult man trying to cause trouble. She saw the silent plea of someone drowning. In the past 2 weeks, she had never seen him ask for anything. He had accepted everything, the meals, the pills, the care, with the indifference of a man who no longer cared what happened to him. But now he was asking, one night, just one night. Kennedy drew a deep breath. Then she made the decision she would later realize had changed everything. All right. One night, she closed her hand around the pill and slipped it into her pocket instead of giving it to Ashton. Something flickered in his eyes. It wasn't joy, but maybe it was relief. "Thank you." He said it so quietly, Kennedy almost didn't hear it. It was the first time he had ever thanked her. That night, Kennedy lay in bed in her own room, staring up at the ceiling, wondering whether she had just made a terrible mistake. But eventually she drifted into sleep, and her worries dissolved into the dark. The next morning, she woke as she always did, prepared breakfast, set it on a tray, and walked into Ashton's room. He was already awake, but instead of sitting propped against the pillows, looking out the window as usual, he was staring down at his hand, staring without blinking. Kennedy stopped in the doorway, feeling that something in the air was different. "Is something wrong?" she asked, her voice cautious. Ashton didn't answer. He kept staring at his hand, his eyes wide with something Kennedy couldn't immediately read. Fear, hope, or disbelief too fragile to name. Kennedy moved closer and set the breakfast tray on the table beside the bed. She followed the direction of Ashton's gaze and looked at the hand resting on top of the blanket. And then she saw it. Ashton's index finger moved. Not a twitch, not some involuntary spasm, a deliberate movement. Slow, clear, as though someone had just switched on a circuit that had been dead for 6 months. Kennedy stood frozen, the tray nearly slipping from her hands. She watched Ashton's finger move again, and felt as though the whole world had tilted on its axis. Ashton looked up at her, and for the first time his dark eyes held light, the light of a man who had just glimpsed a thread of hope in endless darkness. "Do you see it?" His voice trembled, stripped of all coldness and indifference. "I can feel it. I can actually feel it." For the first time in 6 months, Kennedy didn't know what to say. She only stood there, looking at Ashton, looking at the finger that was still moving ever so slightly, and felt something cold spread down her spine. She should have been happy. She should have run for a doctor, told Monica, celebrated the fact that her patient was recovering. But instead, her mind began fitting the pieces together. Last night, he hadn't taken the pill. This morning, he could move. For 6 months, he had taken that pill every day. For 6 months, he hadn't been able to move at all. A coincidence? Or not a coincidence at all? Kennedy looked down at the pocket where the white pill still rested from the night before, and for the first time, She began to question the thing Monica had called medicine, meant to stabilize his condition. Kennedy spent that entire morning in a state of quiet unease. She moved through her work like a machine, straightening the room, preparing lunch, checking whether Ashton needed anything, but her mind was somewhere else entirely. Again and again, she found herself watching Ashton's fingers, waiting to see whether they would move once more. From time to time they did, faintly, delicately, like butterfly wings brushing the air, and each time they did, the question in her mind rang louder. Why? Why was it the very night he didn't take the pill that he began to recover? Ashton said nothing about it. He was quieter than usual, his eyes drifting now and then to his own hand with an expression Kennedy couldn't quite decipher. She didn't know what he was thinking. Maybe he was asking himself the same questions. Or maybe he was simply trying to adjust to the strange new sensation of feeling his own hands again after 6 months of numb paralysis. Afternoon came, and with it the familiar sound of the doorbell. Kennedy opened the door and found Monica standing there in a navy dress and her usual strand of pearls. She smiled and stepped inside, as though she were walking into her own kingdom. "Hello, Kennedy. How is everything today?" Kennedy closed the door, and her heart kicked once, hard, against her ribs. She had spent the entire morning wondering whether she should say anything. One part of her insisted this was good news, that any mother would want to know her son was improving. But another part of her, the part that had learned to read people through years of working in the service industry, whispered that something wasn't right. In the end, she decided to speak, because saying nothing would have been even stranger. Because if Monica discovered she had hidden something like this, everything might become much worse. "There's something I need to tell you," Kennedy said, trying to keep her voice even. This morning, his finger moved. Monica had been walking. She stopped abruptly. Not the gradual pause of someone taken by surprise, but a stop so sudden it was as though someone had pressed pause on a remote control. Her whole body went rigid for a single instant, just 1 second. But Kennedy saw it clearly. Monica's expression hardened. Her pale green eyes darkened like a sky before a storm. Her shoulders tensed beneath the expensive fabric of her dress. And on her face, Kennedy saw no joy, no hope, no relief of a mother hearing that her son was getting better. What Kennedy saw was worry, or perhaps fear. Then the moment passed. Monica turned back, and the smile returned to her lips as though it had never left. "That's wonderful," she said, her voice still sweet as honey. "Perhaps the medicine is finally taking effect." Kennedy nodded, but she didn't take her eyes off Monica. She studied every small detail. The slight tilt of her head, the way her fingers tightened around the handle of her handbag, the way that smile, flawless as it was, never reached her eyes, a smile that didn't touch the eyes. Kennedy had seen many smiles like that during her time at the hotel front desk, from guests pretending to be satisfied when they didn't get the room upgrade they wanted, from managers pretending to care while firing employees. It was the smile of people hiding something. Monica turned to look at Kennedy, and this time her gaze was different, sharper, more probing. "You've been giving him his medicine regularly, haven't you? Not missing a single day?" Kennedy felt as though someone had just poured ice water down her spine. "She knows." The thought flashed through her mind like lightning. "She knows I skipped one night." But no, Monica couldn't know. There was no one else here besides Kennedy and Ashton had no way to contact anyone outside. Kennedy drew in a deep breath and forced her face to remain calm. "Yes," she answered, her voice smooth and level. "Every day, right on time, without missing once." Monica looked at her for a long moment. Her pale green eyes moved over Kennedy's face like a security scanner, searching for even the slightest sign of a lie. Kennedy didn't blink. She didn't step back. She had learned how to lie when she was still young, when she had needed to pretend everything was fine while life was falling apart around her. This was only one more time. At last, Monica nodded. "Good." She said it sweetly, but there was an edge beneath her voice Kennedy didn't miss. "Consistency is the most important thing. Keep doing exactly that." Then Monica went into Ashton's room, leaving Kennedy standing alone in the hallway. Kennedy watched her go, her heart heavy as stone. That conversation hadn't been normal. Monica's reaction hadn't been normal. How would an ordinary mother react when she heard her son was improving after 6 months confined to a bed? She would be happy. She would be emotional. She would want more details. She would want to call a doctor immediately. But Monica had done none of those things. She had only asked about the medicine. She had only cared whether Kennedy had been giving Ashton his pills on schedule. Why? Why would a mother not be happy that her son was showing signs of progress? Why was her first question about the medicine rather than her son's condition? Why had her first reaction been worry instead of hope? Kennedy stood there, the questions spinning through her mind like a storm. She could hear Monica speaking to Ashton inside the room, her voice soft and concerned, performing the role of the perfect mother. But Kennedy no longer believed in that performance. When Monica left about 30 minutes later, she paused at the door and looked at Kennedy with a smile Kennedy had already learned to see through. "Thank you for taking such good care of Ashton," Monica said. "I know he isn't easy, but you're doing very well." Kennedy nodded and smiled politely in return. But when the elevator doors closed and Monica disappeared, her smile vanished too. She turned back toward Ashton's room. He was sitting by the window as always, looking out over Central Park below. He knew nothing about the conversation that had just taken place. Knew nothing about Monica's strange reaction. Knew nothing about the suspicions growing larger and darker inside Kennedy's mind. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at his back outlined against the window. She wanted to say something, wanted to ask something, but she didn't know where to begin, so she stayed silent. Not yet. Not too soon. But in her mind, the pieces were already beginning to fall into place. The medicine, Monica, the obsession with making sure it was taken without fail, the strange reaction when Ashton improved, the single night without the pill, the sudden recovery. The picture was slowly beginning to form in Kennedy's mind, and it wasn't beautiful at all. Several days passed under a low, simmering tension. Kennedy continued her work as usual, but she no longer looked at the little white pills the way she once had. Every morning, when she tipped one into the center of her poney, she felt that something about it was wrong, as though she were holding a weapon rather than medicine meant to heal. She still gave the pill to Ashton, because if she didn't, Monica would grow suspicious. But that night, the first night he had been able to move, still haunted her like a ghost that refused to leave. Ashton didn't mention it. He remained as silent as ever, staring out the window for hours at a time. But Kennedy noticed that every now and then he glanced down at his hand, as though checking to see whether the miracle of that night still existed. It didn't. Ever since he had started taking the pills again, his hands had gone still once more. That only deepened the suspicion growing inside Kennedy. On the morning of the 4th day after that happened, Kennedy was in the kitchen preparing lunch when the service doorbell rang. She stopped what she was doing, surprised. The service entrance was for staff and deliveries, tucked away at the back of the penthouse. In nearly 3 weeks of working there, she had never seen anyone use it. Kennedy dried her hands on a towel and went to open the door. Standing in front of her was a man who looked to be about 45. His salt and pepper hair was cut neatly. His dark gray suit was immaculate, without a single wrinkle. His black leather shoes gleamed. He had the polished appearance of a successful businessman or a skilled attorney, but what caught Kennedy's attention most were his eyes, sharp, alert, the eyes of someone accustomed to watching and judging everything around him. "Are you Kennedy Shaw?" the man asked, his voice low and quiet. Kennedy nodded, instinct making her wary at once. "Who are you?" The man glanced over her shoulder into the apartment, as though checking whether anyone else was there. Then he spoke, still keeping his voice at little more than a whisper. "I'm Pierce Lawson, Ashton's assistant before the accident." Kennedy felt her heart begin to beat faster. Ashton's assistant? In the 3 weeks she had been here, she had never heard anyone mention that name. Monica never spoke of anyone from Ashton's former life. It was as though he had no past, no friends, no colleagues, only this room and those white pills. "I shouldn't be here," Pierce said, urgency tightening his voice. Monica banned everyone from seeing Ashton after the accident. She said he needed rest, that he shouldn't have too many visitors, that the doctors had advised it. But I know that's a lie. Kennedy frowned. "Why are you telling me all this?" "Because you're the only one who can get near him," Pierce answered, his eyes locked on hers. "I've watched this family for 15 years. I worked for Ashton's father before he passed away, and then I kept working for Ashton. I know everything about him, about his business, about the people around him, and I've known for a long time that something is wrong." Kennedy felt her throat go dry. "What's wrong?" Pierce didn't answer right away. He looked around once more, then pulled a light brown envelope from inside his jacket. "I took a sample of Ashton's pills 2 months ago." He said it heavily, I sent them to an independent lab for testing. The results are in here. Kennedy stared at the envelope, then back at Pierce. She couldn't understand why a stranger was handing this to her. Why her? Why not the police, a doctor, or anyone with more authority? As though reading her thoughts, Pierce went on. I can't go to the police because I don't have proof of a crime beyond this. I can't get to Ashton because Monica has made sure of that. I'm only a former assistant. I have no standing. But you're different. You're beside him every day. You can see what's happening. Kennedy took the envelope and felt how strangely light it was in her hand. What truth could something so small contain that would make a man like Pierce come here in secret like this? She opened it and pulled out a sheet of paper filled with numbers and medical terminology. She didn't understand all of it, but one section had been marked with a yellow highlighter, and those words she could read. Motor nerve signal inhibitor. Causes interference with the transmission of signals from the brain to the muscles. Prolonged use may result in loss of muscle control, paralysis, and in severe cases, permanent paralysis. Kennedy felt the world begin to spin. She had to grab the doorframe to steady herself. She read it again, then once more, hoping she had misunderstood. But the words remained there, cold and merciless. You understand now, Pierce said. His voice weighted with sorrow. That isn't medicine meant to heal him. It's medicine meant to destroy him. Ashton wasn't permanently paralyzed by the accident. He was made paralyzed by those pills every day for 6 months. Kennedy felt sick. Her hands shook so badly that the lab report trembled like a leaf in the wind. Why? She asked, her voice hoarse and rough. What does she gain by doing this? Pierce looked at her, and his eyes were full of bitterness. Control, he said. As long as Ashton lies in that bed, helpless, unable to do anything for himself, Monica becomes the one who makes every decision. The money, the staff, the business dealings, all of it has to pass through her hands. She controls the Mercer Empire without ever having to face Ashton. Kennedy thought back over everything she had seen in the past 3 weeks. Monica came every day, but she never really spoke to Ashton. She only asked about the pills, checked that everything was proceeding according to plan, and then left, like a manager inspecting a factory, not a mother visiting her son. You have to save him, Pierce said, and now there was pleading in his voice. You're the only one who can do it. Then he stepped back, preparing to leave. But before he turned away, he stopped and added in a voice as low as breath, Be careful of Monica. She isn't as simple as she looks. She has eyes everywhere. If she finds out you know the truth, I don't even want to imagine what will happen. Then Pierce disappeared down the back corridor, leaving Kennedy standing alone with the lab report in her hand. She closed the door, leaned against the wall, and felt as though someone had just driven a fist straight into her stomach. All the suspicions she had carried over the past several days, all the scattered pieces she had been unable to fit together, now had an answer. A brutal answer. Monica was not a devoted stepmother. She was the one poisoning her own stepson, and Kennedy, for the past 3 weeks, had unknowingly become her instrument. Kennedy looked down at the lab report, then toward Ashton's room. He was sitting in there, knowing nothing about this truth, knowing nothing that every pill he swallowed was dragging him farther away from recovery, knowing nothing that the woman he called his stepmother was imprisoning him inside his own body. Kennedy knew the truth now. The question was what she would do with it. Stay silent, keep the job, take the pay, and pretend she knew nothing? Or speak up, face Monica, and accept whatever consequences followed? She looked at the lab report one more time. Then she folded it, slipped it into her pocket, and started toward Ashton's room. She had made her decision. That night, Kennedy lay awake in the small room at the end of the hallway, her eyes wide open as she stared at the ceiling. The lab report was folded neatly beneath her pillow, its weight invisible, yet pressing down on her like a slab of stone. She had read those lines over and over dozens of times, hoping she had misunderstood, hoping this was nothing more than some terrible mistake. But the words did not change. Motor nerve signal inhibitor. Causes paralysis with continued use. Not medicine meant to heal. Medicine meant to harm. The clock on the wall struck 2 in the morning, then 3, then 4. Kennedy still could not sleep. She lay there thinking about the 2 choices before her, like 2 branching roads, each leading to an entirely different future. The first road was silence. Continue the job as though nothing had happened. Give Ashton his pill every morning. Report to Monica every afternoon. Collect her pay every month. Pretend she did not know the truth folded beneath her pillow. Safe. stable, and completely cowardly. The second road was truth. Confront Monica. Expose everything. But then what? She was nobody. A girl with no name, no influence, no power. And Monica was who? The woman controlling the Mercer empire. A woman with money, authority, and connections Kennedy could hardly imagine. If Monica discovered that Kennedy knew the truth, what would happen to her? Losing the job would be the mildest consequence. But what about worse things? She thought of Pierce's warning. Monica has eyes everywhere. She isn't as simple as she looks. Kennedy shivered. But then she thought of Ashton, of the man who sat for hours by the window, staring out at a world he no longer belonged to, of those dark brown eyes that had lost their light, of the 6 months he had spent in bed believing his legs were dead forever, when the truth was that they were only being imprisoned by the white pills he swallowed every day. Who had he once been? Kennedy didn't know much about Ashton Mercer's past. She had only heard whispers that he was a powerful man, that the name Mercer had once made all of New York speak in hushed voices. But now that man was only a shadow of himself, trapped in a luxurious room like a bird inside a golden cage. And she, Kennedy Shaw, was the only one who knew where the key to that cage was hidden. She had the right to walk away, to pretend she saw nothing. But could she live with herself after that? By the time dawn began to lighten the sky, Kennedy had her answer. She would tell him the truth, whatever the cost. At 7 in the morning, Kennedy prepared breakfast as she always did. Her hands trembled slightly as she set the tray in place, but she forced herself to stay calm. She walked into Ashton's room and closed the door behind her. Ashton was sitting propped against his pillows, gazing out the window as usual. But when he heard the door close, he turned, and his eyes narrowed when he saw Kennedy's expression. "What is it?" he asked, his voice still cold, though touched now by a flicker of curiosity. Kennedy did not circle around the matter. She stepped to the side of the bed, pulled the lab report from her pocket, and laid it across Ashton's lap. "You need to read this." Ashton looked down at the paper, then back up at Kennedy, his eyes filled with suspicion. But he still picked it up and began to read. Kennedy stood there, watching every change that passed across his face. First came confusion, as he tried to make sense of the dense medical terms, then disbelief, as he began to understand what the words meant, and finally anger, a fierce anger rising like fire, flushing his face red and tightening his jaw. Ashton threw the paper down onto the blanket, his dark brown eyes blazing as he looked at Kennedy. "Who the hell do you think you are?" His voice was icy, but it trembled with rage. "Some maid who's been here a few weeks, and you think you can hand me forged papers and accuse my family?" Kennedy did not step back. She had expected this reaction. "It isn't forged," she said, her voice calm even though her heart was pounding like a war drum. "It's a lab result from an independent facility. The medicine you take every day isn't treating you. It contains a nerve signal inhibitor. It's stopping your recovery. It's killing you." Ashton gave a sharp, bitter laugh, but it did nothing to conceal the confusion in his eyes. "That's absurd. Monica is my stepmother. She's taken care of me for 6 months. She's the only one who stayed when everybody else walked away. Why would she want to hurt me? She's the one giving you the pills every day," Kennedy replied, her voice steady and firm. "She's the one controlling what you drink, what you eat, and who gets to see you. Have you ever asked yourself why you haven't recovered after 6 months? Why nobody is allowed to visit you? Why Pierce Lawson, your closest assistant, was forbidden to come see you?" Ashton went still at the mention of Pierce's name. "You know Pierce? He came here," Kennedy said. "He gave me this report. He suspected something for a long time, but he had no way to reach you." Monica cut everyone off. Ashton fell silent, his hands clamped around the edge of the bed, his knuckles whitening with the force of the grip. "You're lying," he said, but his voice no longer carried the certainty it had before. "You're lying. I'm not asking you to believe me," Kennedy said. "But do you remember that night? The night I didn't give you the pill? The next morning, you moved. For the first time in 6 months. Was that a coincidence?" Ashton didn't answer. He looked down at his hand, the hand that had moved for a brief moment and then gone still again after he resumed taking the pills. "If you don't believe me, test it yourself," Kennedy said, her voice softening. "Pretend to take the pill, but don't swallow it. 1 week. Just 1 week. If nothing changes, then I was wrong, and I'll walk out of here immediately. But if you begin to recover..." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Ashton understood. He looked at her for a long time, his dark brown eyes filled with conflict. Then, at last, he nodded. All right, 1 week. The days that followed were the longest of Kennedy's life. Every morning, she brought Ashton the pill. He took it, lifted it to his mouth, pretended to swallow, then hid it beneath his tongue until Kennedy left the room. She didn't know where he kept the pills afterward, and she didn't ask. For the first 3 days, nothing happened. Kennedy began to worry. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe all of it had been coincidence. Maybe Pierce had made some terrible mistake. But on the 4th day, Ashton called her into his room, and his voice sounded different from usual. "Come here," he said, his eyes lowered toward his legs. Kennedy stepped closer, her heart racing. Ashton focused, his face taut with effort. Then she saw it. His big toe moved, slightly, slowly, but unmistakably. On the 6th day, Ashton was able to bend his knee a little. Not much, only a few degrees. But it was more than he had been able to do in 6 months. On the 7th day, when Kennedy walked into the room, she found Ashton looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. The coldness was gone. The indifference was gone. What remained was fury and pain. "You were right," Ashton said, his voice low and heavy as lead. "She did this to me, for 6 months. Kennedy said nothing. She only stood there and looked at the man before her. For the first time, she saw the fracture in the shell of his coldness. For the first time, she saw him as a real human being, carrying pain and injury too deep for words. Ashton turned and looked back toward the window, his eyes darkening like a storm sky. "Why?" he asked, sounding as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. "I never did anything to her. My father loved her. I respected her. Why would she do this?" Kennedy had no answer. She only knew that the truth had been brought into the light, and now nothing would ever be the same again. Ashton turned back to her, his gaze hardening. "I'm not going to let this go," he said, his voice like cold steel. "She wanted to keep me on this bed forever, but she miscalculated one thing." He looked straight into Kennedy's eyes. "She never accounted for you." From that day on, everything between Kennedy and Ashton changed completely. There was no longer the cold distance between caregiver and patient. No more clipped answers. No more indifferent glances. Now they were allies, 2 people sharing a dangerous secret and standing together against a common enemy. On the surface, nothing had changed. Kennedy still rose early to prepare meals, still brought Ashton his medicine every morning, still reported to Monica whenever she came to visit that everything was fine, that he was taking the pills regularly, that there were no problems. Monica still nodded with satisfaction, still smiled, that smile that never reached her eyes, still left after about an hour with the expression of a woman who believed she controlled everything perfectly. But inside the closed room at the end of the hallway, a quiet resurrection was taking place. Every night, when the penthouse sank into silence and the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls, Kennedy slipped into Ashton's room. She helped him practice, beginning with the simplest things, moving his fingers, rotating his wrists, flexing his ankles, motions ordinary people made without a thought. But for Ashton, each one was a battle. His body had been suppressed for too long. 6 months without movement had left his muscles badly weakened, but his nervous system was not dead. It had only been imprisoned by those white pills, and now that the chains had been removed, it was slowly waking up. In the first week, Ashton was able to move both feet. In the second week, he could bend his knees and hold them that way for a few seconds before the muscles gave out. By the 3rd week, he could sit up without Kennedy's help. Every small step forward felt like a victory. Kennedy could see the change not only in Ashton's body, but in his eyes. Those dark brown eyes that had once been as lifeless as stagnant water were beginning to come alive again. There was fire in them now. Resolve. He was no longer the shadow sitting by the window, looking out at the world with quiet surrender. He was preparing to take his life back. Pierce began contacting Kennedy more often, through a small phone he had slipped to her during one brief meeting at the back entrance. He sent coded messages, keeping her informed about what was happening beyond the walls of the penthouse. The news was not good. Monica had become very active. She had met with lawyers several times over the past week, signed a series of documents, and changed multiple authorization papers. Pierce had discovered that Monica was quietly moving assets from Ashton's companies into other accounts, accounts controlled by her alone. She did not merely want Ashton helpless for a little while. She was preparing for a future in which Ashton was absent, or existed only as a living corpse in a hospital bed. Kennedy handed the phone to Ashton so he could read the messages for himself. He read them in silence, his face expressionless, but she could see the tightness in his jaw and the veins rising at his temples. "She's stealing everything," Ashton said, his voice calm in a way that was almost frightening. "Piece by piece. While I lie here, she's carving up my family's empire." Kennedy didn't know what to say. She simply stood there, watching the man before her swallow down his fury and turn it into resolve. One night, about 3 weeks after they began their plan, Kennedy was helping Ashton practice standing. He had reached the point where he could stay on his feet for a few seconds if he had something to hold on to, but his legs were still weak, his muscles still too frail to bear the full weight of his body. Kennedy stood in front of him, both hands gripping his arms, steadying him while he struggled to remain upright. Ashton held tightly to her arms, his face taut with effort. He managed to stay standing for about 10 seconds. Then his legs began to tremble. Kennedy felt him starting to lose balance and stepped forward at once, catching him before he fell. For one brief moment, they were very close. She could feel his breath. She could smell soap and something else, something faintly like sandalwood from the shampoo she had bought for him. Ashton looked down at her, and his dark brown eyes no longer held the coldness of those first days. There was something else there now. Curiosity, concern, something she had never seen in him before. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice low. Kennedy didn't understand the question at first. "Helping you stand?" "No." Ashton shook his head slightly. "All of this. You could have stayed quiet, kept doing your job, taken the paycheck. You had no reason to get involved in my trouble. And yet you're still here. Why?" Kennedy was silent for a long time, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she had never said it out loud before. "Because I know what that feels like," she said at last, her voice soft. "To have everything taken from you and not be able to do a thing about it." Ashton looked at her, waiting. Kennedy went on, turning her eyes toward the window so she wouldn't have to meet his gaze. "My parents died when I was 19, a car accident. One second they were there, and the next second they were gone. I lost everything. My home, my money, my future. I had to leave school, start working, and fight just to survive one day at a time. And no one helped me. No one." She turned back to look at Ashton. "You had money, power, all the things I never had. But everything was stolen from you too. You were trapped inside your own body, betrayed by someone you trusted. I couldn't help myself back then, but I can help you now." Ashton was quiet for a long while. Then he spoke, and his voice was gentler than she had ever heard it before. "You do know who you're standing against, don't you? Monica isn't easy to fight. If she finds out what we're doing, you'll be in danger." "I know," Kennedy answered without hesitation. "You've chosen a side. Do you understand that? There's no going back." "I understand." Ashton looked at her for a long time, his dark brown eyes searching, as though he were trying to read her very soul. Then he nodded, as though he had found the answer he needed. "I don't forget what I owe," he said, his voice low but certain. "When all of this is over, I'll protect you." Kennedy smiled faintly, trying to lift the heaviness in the room. "Worry about yourself first. You can't even stand properly yet, and you're already talking about protecting someone else." Ashton looked at her. And then something unexpected happened. He laughed. Not the cold, mocking sound she had heard the first day they met. A real laugh. Small, brief, but real. It was the first time Kennedy had ever heard Ashton Mercer laugh, and in that moment, she saw another part of him. The man beneath the cold shell, the part that had been buried for the past 6 months. She would help him take that part back, no matter what it cost her. Everything had been going smoothly until that afternoon. Kennedy was in Ashton's room, helping him practice sitting up. It was part of their daily routine now, disguised beneath the appearance of ordinary patient care. Ashton had made enormous progress in the past few weeks. He could sit up on his own, move both legs, even stand for several minutes if he had something to hold on to. All of it had to remain hidden, practiced only at night when no one else was around. But that day, Kennedy made a mistake. She was helping Ashton rise from a lying position, a movement that had become too natural, too instinctive, after weeks of practice. She no longer had to struggle or hesitate the way she had in the early days. The two of them moved together with the easy rhythm of dance partners who had trained side by side for years, and that was the exact moment the door opened. Monica stood in the doorway, without knocking, without warning. She had arrived at least 2 hours earlier than usual. Kennedy froze, her hands still bracing Ashton's back. She felt her heart stop for one hard beat. Monica said nothing. She only stood there, her pale green eyes sweeping across the room, over Kennedy, over Ashton, over the way the two of them were touching. Her eyes narrowed, just slightly, but enough for Kennedy to notice. She had seen something. Maybe it was the ease in the way Kennedy handled Ashton. Too natural, too familiar. Maybe it was the way Ashton sat up too easily, without the helplessness he had worn for months. Maybe it was the look in their eyes when they glanced at each other, no longer cold and distant like patient and caregiver. Kennedy forced herself to stay calm. She completed the motion, gently settling Ashton back against the pillows as though this were nothing more than ordinary work. "Hello," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could. "You're early today." Monica stepped into the room, the sound of her heels landing in an even rhythm across the wooden floor. "I was nearby, so I thought I'd stop in." "How is Ashton today?" Kennedy opened her mouth to answer, but Ashton spoke first, the same as always. His voice was cold, indifferent, exactly as it had always been. "Nothing has changed." Monica looked at him for a long moment, then smiled. That familiar smile that never reached her eyes. "Good," she said. "I'm glad Miss Shaw is taking such good care of you." Monica stayed for about 15 minutes, asked a few polite questions, checked the pill bottle, then left. There was nothing unusual in her words or her actions, but Kennedy felt that something had shifted. It was in Monica's eyes before she left the room, the way her gaze lingered on Kennedy for a second longer than usual. That night, around 11 o'clock, Kennedy's phone vibrated. She was lying in bed, getting ready to sleep. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. Kennedy opened it and felt the blood turn cold in her veins. It was a photograph. Her old apartment in the Bronx, the aging building with its stained walls, its rusted iron stairs, its dusty windows. The angle of the photo was clear, taken from across the street, as though someone had been standing there watching, waiting, taking pictures. And beneath the photo was a single line of text. "I hope you like your new job. It would be a shame if you had to go back here, or had nowhere left to go back to." Kennedy stared at the message, her hands trembling. She read the words again and again, hoping she had misunderstood, but there was no misunderstanding. The meaning was as plain as daylight. This was a threat, Monica knew, or at least she suspected enough to send a warning. Kennedy didn't sleep that night. She lay on her bed, staring up at the ceiling, thinking about the photograph, the message, Monica's eyes before she had left the room that afternoon. Monica was watching her. She had people watching her. The next morning, Kennedy brought the phone into Ashton's room. She handed it to him without saying a word. Ashton read the message, and his face darkened like a sky before a storm. His jaw locked tight, the veins in his neck rising. "She dares to threaten you." His voice was low and dangerous, like the growl of a beast. Kennedy tried to stay calm, though her heart was still beating fast. "I'm not afraid," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I knew from the beginning there was risk in this." Ashton looked at her, his dark brown eyes burning. "You don't understand," he said, his voice hard with certainty. "She doesn't make empty threats. I know Monica. She never speaks lightly. If she sent this message, it means she's already considering action. So what do we do?" Kennedy asked. "Run?" Ashton shook his head. "Running is not an option. Never an option." He looked straight into her eyes, his gaze hard as steel. "You're mine to protect now. You chose to stand with me. And I protect the people who stand with me. Anyone who touches you will pay for it." Kennedy looked at him. For the first time in a very long while, she felt protected. Not because Ashton was physically strong. He still couldn't walk normally, still needed help with many things. But because for the first time, someone was willing to stand beside her. Someone considered her important enough to defend. Ever since her parents died, she had faced everything alone. Alone against life. Alone through hardship. Alone every time she had to pull herself back up after falling. No one beside her. No one who cared. But now, looking into Ashton's eyes, she knew she was not alone anymore. We can't wait any longer, Ashton said, his voice decisive. Monica has already begun to suspect. If we don't act first, she will. And when that happens, we lose the advantage. Do you have a plan? Kennedy asked. Ashton nodded slowly. I've been thinking about that for a long time. It's time to show her that the prey she thought was dead is still alive, and it's about to come back with teeth. That night, Ashton called Pierce on the secret phone. Kennedy sat beside him, listening to the conversation with her heart pounding fast. They needed a plan, an opportunity to expose Monica in front of everyone. Not only her, but also the accomplices who had helped her carry out the scheme for 6 months. Pierce proposed the idea, and Ashton agreed at once. A party. Not an ordinary party, but a farewell gathering. Ashton would announce that his condition was deteriorating quickly, that the doctors had no hope left, that he wanted one final chance to see the important people in his life before that chance was gone forever. Monica wouldn't be able to refuse. She would have to organize the event, would have to invite everyone who needed to be there, would have to play the grieving stepmother in front of them all, and she would bring her accomplices with her. The doctor who had prescribed the poison, the lawyer who had helped transfer the assets, all of them in the same room together. That would be the moment they struck. The next 2 weeks were the most tense weeks of Kennedy's life. By day, she continued playing the obedient caregiver, reporting to Monica that everything was fine, that Ashton was growing weaker, that the medicine was being taken regularly. Monica seemed satisfied with those reports. She didn't send any more threatening messages, and she didn't make any more surprise visits. Perhaps she thought her warning had worked, that Kennedy had been frightened back into becoming her obedient tool. She didn't know that each night, when the penthouse sank into darkness, a quiet preparation was unfolding. Ashton practiced walking every night. Kennedy steadied him step by step, from the bed to the window, from the window to the bedroom door, then along the hallway. His legs were still weak, trembling after every few steps, but each day they grew a little steadier. He was like a wounded beast slowly healing, and in his eyes Kennedy saw a fire she had never seen there before, the fire of a man preparing to reclaim what was his. Outside those walls, Pierce worked without rest. He gathered evidence, security camera footage, recordings of phone calls, financial documents showing irregular transactions, forged signatures, assets transferred unlawfully. Everything was collected, arranged carefully, prepared to be projected onto a large screen at exactly the right moment. Monica organized the party without realizing she was stepping into a trap. She hired decorators for the penthouse, ordered food from the most expensive restaurants in the city, sent invitations to the most important people in the Mercer family's network. She even visited Ashton every day during the final week, playing the worried stepmother, asking after his health, holding his hand with a mask of tender pity. Ashton played his role flawlessly. He lay in bed with heavy, lidded eyes and a weak voice, like a man slowly fading away. Each time Monica came, he seemed weaker than the time before, and she believed it completely, believed her plan was succeeding, believed her stepson was on the verge of becoming a permanent living corpse. The day of the party arrived. The penthouse overflowed with light and the soft murmur of music. Guests began arriving at 6 in the evening, all strangers to Kennedy, men in expensive suits, women in shimmering gowns, all of them people from the upper world she had only ever seen in magazines. Kennedy stood in the corner wearing the simple black clothes of a server. She watched each guest as they entered, trying to identify the faces Pierce had sent her in advance. Dr. Hugh Weston, the silver-haired man with gold-rimmed glasses, the one who had prescribed Ashton's poison for 6 months. Attorney Bernard Cross, the lawyer who had helped Monica forge signatures and transfer assets, and several other faces Kennedy didn't recognize, but she knew they were all links in Monica's conspiracy. Monica stood in the middle of the living room, radiant in an elegant black gown with her ever-present pearls at her throat. She played the grieving stepmother perfectly, eyes red, voice trembling as she spoke about Ashton's condition, dabbing at fake tears while receiving condolences from the guests. Kennedy looked at her and felt sick. At 7:30, Ashton was wheeled into the living room. Kennedy pushed the chair herself, and she could feel his hands gripping the armrests tightly, not from weakness, but from tension. Ashton looked truly frail, his shoulders slumped, his eyes dull, his skin pale. It was a perfect performance, and Monica was completely deceived. She stepped to the wheelchair and placed a hand on Ashton's shoulder with an air of pity. "How are you feeling, darling?" she asked, her voice so sweet it sounded false. Ashton lifted his eyes to her, his expression exhausted. "I'd like to say a few words to everyone," he replied, his voice weak. "It may be the last chance I have." Monica nodded, her face full of tender sympathy. "Of course, my dear." She turned to the guests and clapped her hands lightly to gather their attention. "Everyone, Ashton would like to say a few words." The room slowly fell silent. Every eye turned toward the wheelchair in the center of the room. Kennedy stepped back one pace, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone might hear it. She looked at the clock on the wall. 8 o'clock in the evening, right on schedule. Ashton glanced at her and gave the slightest nod. Kennedy nodded back, then secretly pressed the button on the small remote hidden in her pocket, the signal for Pierce in the control room behind the scenes. It was time. The performance was about to end. And Monica Hale was about to discover that the prey she thought was already dead was still alive, and it was about to bite back. The room fell silent when Ashton began to speak. His voice was weak and trembling, perfect for the image of a man standing on the edge of death. "I want to thank all of you for coming here tonight," he said, his eyes moving across each face in the room. "I know my condition isn't good. The doctors have said there isn't much time left. This may be the last time we ever have the chance to gather like this." Soft murmurs of sympathy spread through the room. A few women lifted handkerchiefs to their eyes. Monica stood right beside the wheelchair, her hand resting on Ashton's shoulder with an air of pity, her face the perfect portrait of a mother grieving for her son. Kennedy stood in the corner of the room, watching everything. She saw Dr. Weston standing near the window, his expression solemn. Attorney Cross stood by the drinks table, a glass of champagne in his hand, looking at Ashton with a gaze Kennedy couldn't read. None of them knew the trap had already been set. Ashton continued, his voice still frail. "There is one person I especially want to thank tonight, someone who has stayed by my side for the past 6 months, caring for me every single day, never shrinking from the burden." Monica gave a modest smile and lowered her head slightly, as though embarrassed to be praised in front of everyone. She thought Ashton was speaking about her. Everyone in the room thought so. "The person who gave me my medicine every day." Ashton went on, his voice slow and measured, never missing a single day, never forgetting a single dose. Monica nodded, her eyes shining with what looked like emotional tears. She was savoring the moment, taking in the admiration of the guests, strengthening the image of the devoted stepmother she had worked so carefully to build. "The medicine that was supposed to heal me," Ashton said, then stopped. Silence for 1 second, 2 seconds. Then he lifted his head, looked straight into Monica's eyes, and suddenly his voice was no longer weak. "The medicine that was supposed to kill me." The smile on Monica's lips froze, her eyes flew open, and for the briefest instant her pale green gaze flashed with panic before she managed to take control of her expression again. The room began to stir with uneasy murmurs. Guests looked at one another, unable to understand what was happening. "Ashton, what are you saying?" Monica spoke up, her voice still trying to sound sweet, though a small crack had opened in it. "You're not well. You're confused." At that exact moment, the large screen behind the speaking platform lit up. No one had time to react. The first image that appeared was the lab report, with the highlighted line enlarged so everyone in the room could read it. "Motor nerve signal inhibitor. Causes paralysis with continued use." The whispering in the room grew louder. Then the next image appeared. Financial transactions. Numbers showing money being moved from Mercer Company accounts into accounts under Monica Hale's name. Millions of dollars. Over 6 months. Then came the audio recording. Monica's voice rang clearly through the speakers. "Increase the dosage. I want to make sure he never gets up again." Dr. Weston's voice answered, "If we raise it any more, there could be serious side effects." Monica's voice turned cold. "I don't care. Do it." The room went dead still. Monica stood there, her face white as paper, eyes fixed on the screen in horror. She turned to Ashton, then to the guests, then toward the door. "This is slander," she screamed, her voice shrill. "This is fabricated. He's lost his mind. He's accusing me with lies." But no one was listening to her. Everyone was staring at the screen, where the evidence continued to unfold. Page after page of documents, recording after recording, number after number, all of it pointing to one brutal truth. Monica Hale had tried to murder her stepson. And then Ashton did the one thing no one expected. He placed both hands on the arms of the wheelchair. Slowly, deliberately, the muscles in his arms tightened as he forced himself upward, and he stood. The room seemed to stop breathing. Kennedy saw the shocked faces, the open mouths. The eyes widened in disbelief at what they were witnessing. Ashton Mercer, the man who had been confined to a bed for 6 months, the man everyone believed would never stand again, was standing there on his own 2 legs. His legs trembled. His muscles were weak after months of disuse. But he was standing, and then he began to walk, step by step, slow, steady, toward Monica. Monica stumbled backward, her eyes wide with terror. She looked as though she were seeing a ghost, and in a sense, that was exactly what she was seeing. The prey she had believed was dead was walking toward her, step by step, like a sentence drawing near. "No," she stammered, taking another step back. "That's impossible. You can't. I'm not insane, Monica," Ashton said, his voice cold as forged steel. "And I'm not dead either. But you're about to pay for what you did." Monica turned and ran for the door. But the door had already opened, and Pierce Lawson stepped inside with several men in black suits. They blocked the exit, their cold eyes fixed on Monica like hunters staring at trapped prey. She turned, searching desperately for allies. Dr. Weston was trying to slip toward the back exit, but 2 other men had already cut him off. Attorney Cross stood frozen in the middle of the room, his champagne glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor, his face gone gray as if he were about to faint. There was no escape. Monica turned back to face Ashton, and now the fear on her face had twisted into hatred. Her pale green eyes burned like hellfire as she stared at him. "I gave you a home when your father died," she hissed, her voice stripped of sweetness and filled with venom. "I took care of you, worried over you, sacrificed for you. And this is how you repay me?" Ashton stopped in front of her, only a few steps away. He looked down at the woman who had once made him believe he would never stand again, the woman who had poisoned him for 6 months while playing the role of savior. "You gave me a home," Ashton said, his voice cold and void of emotion. "Then you turned me into a prisoner inside it. You gave me medicine every day and told me it would help me recover, when in truth it was killing me piece by piece. You stroked my hand and comforted me while those same hands were signing documents to steal everything that belonged to me." He leaned closer, looking straight into Monica's eyes. "You say you sacrificed for me?" "No, Monica. You wanted me dead. You just wanted me to die slowly enough for you to have time to take everything first." Monica could say nothing. She stood there trembling, her face twisted with a mixture of rage and fear. Pierce stepped forward and signaled for his men to take Monica and her accomplices out of the room. Kennedy stood in the corner, watching Monica being led away. She was still screaming and cursing, but no one was listening anymore. Justice had finally been done, and Ashton Mercer was standing there on his own 2 feet, watching the empire he had nearly lost slowly begin to return to his hands. 3 months after that fateful night of the party, everything had changed completely. There was a small room in the basement of Mercer Tower, a room most people didn't even know existed. No windows, no telephone, no internet, no way at all to contact the outside world. The furnishings were still beautiful by Mercer family standards. A soft bed with immaculate white sheets, an elegant oak table and chairs, wall lamps casting a warm glow. It had every comfort needed for an easy life. But the door was always locked from the outside. Monica Hale sat on the bed with her back against the headboard, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. She spent hours that way every day, with nothing to do except think. Think about what had happened, about what she had done, about what she had lost. 6 months earlier, she had controlled everything. She had been the one giving orders, the one holding the power of life and death within the Mercer Empire. She had believed her plan was perfect: poison Ashton slowly, seize the fortune, then spend the rest of her life in wealth without anyone ever suspecting a thing. Now she was the prisoner, not in a government prison, but in one created by her own victim. A prison with no sentence, no release date, no hope. The sound of the lock turning broke the silence. Monica lifted her head, her heart beating faster the way it always did whenever that door opened. Kennedy Shaw stepped inside, carrying a silver tray. On it was Monica's meal, a plate of salad, a serving of seared salmon, a glass of fresh orange juice, and 1 small white pill. Monica looked at the pill, and her face drained of color the way it did every time. "What is that?" she asked, her voice hoarse from being used so rarely. Kennedy set the tray down on the table beside the bed, calm and composed, as though this were nothing more than a routine task. "A vitamin," she answered softly. Good for your health. Ashton is very concerned about your well-being. Monica didn't move. Her pale green eyes that had once been sharp and calculating, were now full of confusion and fear as they stayed fixed on the tiny white pill resting on the tray. How do I know it isn't what I gave him? She asked, her voice trembling. Kennedy paused. Then she turned and looked at Monica, and a smile appeared on her lips. A gentle smile. Harmless. Perfect. But it didn't reach her eyes. It was the same smile Monica had used for 6 months before that, when she handed Ashton his pills, when she asked about his health, when she played the devoted stepmother in front of everyone, and now that smile was being returned to her. You don't know, Kennedy answered, her voice still soft as a lullaby. Just like Ashton didn't know when he took your pills for 6 months. Just like you wanted him never to know. Monica looked at Kennedy, then at the pill, then back at Kennedy. Her hands trembled. Her lips moved as though she wanted to say something, but no words came. Kennedy turned and walked toward the door. Before stepping out, she stopped without looking back. See you tomorrow, Monica. The door closed with the soft click of the lock. Monica sat alone in the room, staring at the white pill on the tray. Her hands were still shaking. Was it really a vitamin? Or was it something else? She would never know. Tomorrow there would be another pill. And the next day. And the day after that. Every day, with every meal, she would have to face that question. She would have to stare at that tiny white pill and wonder whether this was the last day of her life. For the first time in her life, Monica Hale understood what it meant to be imprisoned inside her own fear. On the 60th floor, the penthouse was flooded with the light of sunset. The last rays of day painted the glass walls in gold, casting long bands of brightness across the wooden floor. Ashton Mercer stood by the great window, looking down at Manhattan below. The city was shifting from day into night, its lights beginning to flicker on like stars falling to earth. His legs had not yet fully recovered. At times they still trembled, still weakened after a long day, but he could stand. On his own, no wheelchair, no one holding him up. No more white pills Monica had forced down his throat for 6 months. Kennedy walked over and stood beside him without saying a word. For a long while, the two of them remained there in silence, looking out at the city as it slowly disappeared into dusk. Ashton was the first to break the silence. You can leave whenever you want, he said, his voice low and quiet. Your job is done. I'll pay you 10 times what I promised. You can start a new life anywhere you choose. Kennedy didn't answer right away. She kept looking out the window, at the towers slowly lighting up, at the traffic below like lines of tiny ants, at the sky shifting from orange to violet. When I first walked into this penthouse, I had nothing, she said softly. No home, because I was about to be thrown out into the street. No money, because I had $36 left in my account. No one, because my parents were gone, and I didn't have even one friend. Ashton turned to look at her, waiting. And now, Kennedy turned to face him, her gray-blue eyes meeting his dark brown ones. Now, for the first time in my life, I feel like I belong somewhere. Ashton said nothing, but the corner of his mouth lifted ever so slightly, a smile so small it was almost impossible to see, yet completely real. Then stay, he said. It wasn't an order. It wasn't a request. It was simply an invitation. Kennedy gave him a faint smile. Then she nodded. They stood there side by side, looking out at the city as it slowly sank into the light of evening. Behind them was the darkness they had already survived, the months of pain, betrayal, and struggle. Ahead of them was something new, something still unformed, but filled with hope. And for the first time in a very long while, neither of them felt alone anymore. That is the story of the white pill, of betrayal and justice, of two people who found one another in the dark, and of how sometimes karma doesn't need to wait for the next life. Dear friends, we have traveled together through an emotional journey with the story of Kennedy and Ashton. How did this story make you feel? Leave a comment below and share what is in your heart. We would truly love to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, press like, and share it so we can keep bringing you compelling stories every day. Wishing all of you watching this video good health, a joyful life, and days filled with peace and happiness. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you in the next video.